force. And just so for those of you on the task force who see a name on the screen up there, but don't know who that is, it's Becky Wasserman, who is the attorney that's been working with this issue all along, and she's just back from a leave. So she'll be taking over now from David Hall, just so that you know who that name is. Okay. So Chris.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Chris Ripchart, Fiscal. You already heard a little bit about from the treasurer about the FY21 actuarial valuations that we just got on Friday afternoon. But over the weekend, I took a look through it and prepared just a few slides that are on the website that just take those numbers and try to put them in some context about what last year's valuation predicted, so we can kind of see the year-over-year difference. This is kind of a long slide deck, but we don't need to spend time on like the last 20 slides. Really what I did was updated all of the charts that were in the interim report from a couple weeks ago to include the FY21 data. So that's what's in those last 20 or so slides, just so folks can have a sense of, now that we have the most recent valuation, what looks different compared to what we've been looking at for the last couple weeks. So my conclusions looking at the valuations are in lockstep with the state treasurers. You know, we had a very interesting kind of year where we had really, really strong investment returns in FY21. But due to the way we smooth things, most of that gain really will not be recognized yet until subsequent years. We did have some really positive news that the assets grew faster than the liabilities. That means that, you know, we're kind of in a weird spot where the unfunded liabilities grew a little bit in dollar terms compared to last year, but not in relative terms. So that's why you see that the dollar figure of the unfunded liability went up and the funded ratio improved at the same time. Why did we not see a bigger gain? Well, it's because we had higher than expected COLAs due to the CPI, which I think a lot of folks kind of assumed would be the case this year, just given the way the CPI has trended. And we've had some retirement experience that has resulted in actuarial loss. We also had a little bit of negative amortization that occurred, and that's due to timing reasons. So whenever the assumption changes happened in the fall of 2020, that resulted in pretty significant increases in the unfunded liability and the normal cost, which is why we've all been talking about this, you know, all summer, and kind of goes back to those fiscal targets. But there's a lag between when those numbers come out and when our payments catch up to reflect it. So had interest accruing on larger balances of normal cost and unfunded liability because our payments made last year were based on the pre-assumption FY19 valuation. So now the FY22 contribution that we're making this year is the first year that they've increased to address the new assumptions. So that's why we've had a little bit of negative amortization. I say little, it's, you know, more than $10 million, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not very big as a percentage, but that's what drove that. It's a timing issue between the fact that the balances went up and interest was accruing on those larger balances until our payments caught up with it. So one of the sort of interesting things is that, you know, overall, our future pension costs are expected to be relatively close to what last year's valuation predicted. They will be slightly higher, but not massively higher. It's not a $100 million year-over-year increase like we saw a year ago. So slide 3 just kind of breaks out, all right, what did things look like at the end of the FY21 valuation compared to where we are in the most recent one? So for both systems, you can see that the accrued liabilities grew. They grew by 6% for VSERS and 4.4 for the teachers. But we had a really strong investment year, and that erased deferred market losses that we had last year and created deferred market gains that will be recognized in future years. So a year ago, we had sort of a wind in our face that was going to hold us back in future years as those losses were going to be recognized. Now we have a little bit of a wind at our back. So it doesn't mean that, back to the sort of conversation that was happening this morning, doesn't mean everything's all, you know, all lovely and we have no problem now just because we had 1 year of strong investment returns, because we still need to recognize that strong year, and we don't know what this year will look like or the next year. So there's always that element of uncertainty, but we're moving into the future right now with a little bit of a wind at our back to help us if we see lower than assumed returns in the next couple of years. And just so you see here, you can compare the market value and the actuarial value, and the AVA, the actuarial value, that's what reflects the smoothing, and that is what we use for our funding policies. If you take a look at those percentages at the very bottom, you see these often on the summary chart of the actuarial valuations. They'll show you what is the AVA and the MVA as a percentage of each other. When the actuarial value is larger than the market value, like we saw in FY20, that means you've got deferred losses that need to be recognized in future years. But whenever the opposite is the case, which it now is, that means you've got deferred gains. So on that front, we're in a slightly better position than we were a year ago. Next slide, slide 4 just shows you the difference in the investment rate of return that the actuaries calculate based on the market value as well as the actuarial value basis. So the investment gains, as we've been discussing today, they offset some of those losses from prior years. And you go back to the end of the 20 valuations, the two systems combined had deferred losses of $180 million. Now they have combined deferred gains of $440 million. So that is a positive sign for the funds. And when all is held equal and all of your assumptions are met moving forward, the funded ratio is expected to continue increasing as those gains are recognized in the actuarial math in the upcoming years. But obviously, anything that involves actuarial losses in the next couple of years could undercut that. So this is just one factor of all the different experience factors that go into this.
$620 million shift is
pretty significant. But we also had the strongest investment year since I think the 1980s. So it really was, when you take a look back at how things have been the last 10, 20 plus years, this really was an anomaly of a year. And I think throughout this conversation, we've discussed the timing sensitivity to these measures. And we were very fortunate that the way the market cycle transpired last year was beneficial for our funded ratio improvement, because the market was really, really low toward the end of FY20 and then went up. So a lot of that gain that we saw in the market tended to conform very nicely to the FY21 calendar. If that gain was timed differently, these percentages would look differently. So
it was the only time we've exceeded this performance was in 1984 and 1983 based on the treasurer's slide. So that's a long, long time ago.
And interest rates were very different then.
Yeah, very much.
It's not that long.
You weren't even born.
Slide 5 shows you that just the year-over-year change in the unfunded liabilities, where you can see how they increased slightly for both systems in dollar terms, but the funded ratios also improved slightly. And that's, again, because the assets grew at a faster rate than the liabilities grew. So slide 6 shows you, and this data was also in the treasurer's presentation earlier. It's from the same source, from the valuation, but I just reflected it in a slightly different way, where you see both systems saw some significant actuarial gains from the investment performance, but those gains were offset by some other actuarial losses. So you can see that the COLA experience created 35.6 million of losses for VSERS, 22.6 for the teachers. And again, positive numbers are bad things here. Negative numbers are good things. So negative are the things that reduced the unfunded liability.
And so, Chris, if we stay in an inflationary environment for the next couple of years,
You will continue to see losses from the COLA under current assumptions. Yeah.
If the rate of inflation exceeds the assumed rate in the plan.
Correct. If it exceeds assumptions.
These future months of inflation will be lapping. The base effect of lapping lower inflation will subside and will be lapping higher inflation.
Over time.
Yes.
But we also need to be mindful of these numbers just reflect what happened in the last fiscal year, and we've seen the inflationary trends continue into this fiscal year. So I expect you'll see another actuarial loss for at least one more year.
Can I say one thing too, just if we're talking about the COLA, I want to draw attention to the other bullet there, which is the retirement experience higher than assumed. And I think it's important when we look at demographics and we look at things like cutting pensions to remember that that is in part influenced probably by COVID, but in part influenced by some of the changes that were being suggested to these pension funds last spring, which inspired a flight.
Well, the number of retirements that have gone through, the data I've seen, which is as of about a month ago, does not indicate that there's been a large spike in the number of teachers who have retired over like the 3-year average in the last couple of years.
So then why is this higher than expected?
This doesn't just reflect the number of people that have retired, it can reflect the characteristics of who's retiring as well.
It's interesting because I'm not sure that I've heard that same data. I'd have to check
Yeah,
that.
I can find the table. It's in my email inbox somewhere that came
Yeah.
from the treasurer's office, but we saw, if my memory serves correct, because I don't have it in front of me, I think there was a higher number of teacher retirements in FY20, and then it went down a little bit. And the opposite occurred on the state side.
I think the woman who came from your office, Michael, might have said there was something like a 6-fold increase in the number of people who called or something. It was a crazy number of people were calling, requesting information.
Right, so we, every day of the week, we get requests for information from a variety of people on a number of different things related to the retirement benefits. But the people who actually follow through, who are actually going to retire and follow through with an application, those are the numbers that Chris is talking about. We have not seen like a substantial or dramatic increase in either of the systems or any of the 3 systems in terms of retirements, but do get a lot of requests for what we call estimates. When people call and say, I'm thinking of retiring July 1st, 2024, what will if I continue working until that time, what will my monthly benefit be at that point in time? And unfortunately, our staffing is such that we frequently have to delay responding to those requests, and we respond to the requests for the people who want to retire July 1st, 2021, let's say, and get to those people first because they're looking to retire sooner than 2 or 3 years out.
I'll just add to this, in reviewing the valuation, board member, I saw that this was, the second biggest driver of losses this year. And I did inquire as to the timing of the retirements. And, I was told that there was a large chunk in January when a lot of state employees tend to retire. And you would expect, I think, higher retirements in COVID times because, people are saying, okay, I've had enough, I'm going to do something else. But there was also another large chunk at the towards the end of the fiscal year. I don't think we can precisely pin that down, but I think Molly is correct that we should be thoughtful about how we impact the experience of the plan.
Okay. Slide 7 just shows you what the ADEC has changed from year to year. So the way we do our actuarial, our amortization method statute, you can predict that when all else is equal, the ADEC would increase by roughly 3% a year because the amortization payments are structured to grow by 3% over the prior year. And the normal cost should be trending with the size of the overall payroll growth. So that is anticipated to be 3% a year for the teachers, 3.5% for the state employees. But we saw the ADEX will be they'll grow a little bit higher than that 3% rate. The state employee ADEC will grow by just under 5%, by about $5.9 million. And the teachers will grow by about 4.6%, so just shy of $10 million. And so overall, that ends up being across all funds roughly a $5.3 million higher cost than what we would have otherwise assumed. So that's a far cry from the roughly $100 million increase we saw year to year last year. Slides 8 and 9. I took the predicted amortization schedules for paying down the unfunded liabilities from the FY20 valuation and compared it to the 21 valuation. So you can see how the most recent data is going to change what we expect to pay to resolve the unfunded liability in future years. Overall, the cumulative increase will be about $34.5 million for the state, and that's for every year from 23 through 38 in aggregate, and about $20 million for the teacher system. And you can see by these graphs that the difference in the height of those columns shows you the year-over-year increase compared to what we expected we'd see last year and what we expect to see during the current valuation. So things are not wildly out of proportion to what was expected a year ago. Costs are predicted to go up a little bit, but we're not looking to see anything close to the magnitude of increases that we saw last year. Slide 10 just shows some demographic changes for each group, and you can see how sort of the number of active members and retirees and the salaries have changed. I also have some graphic depictions of this a little bit later in the slides, but you can see that the VSERS active membership went down quite a bit from 8,539 members to 8,192. Treasurer hinted on this in her remarks earlier that the state is carrying an awful lot of vacant positions. This is where you're seeing that show up in the actuarial valuation. The number of retirees and beneficiaries who are currently getting a benefit out of the system also increased. The average active salary, increased marginally, as you would kind of expect over time through salary growth over the active workforce. Active age and years of service are pretty much in line with where they have been in recent years. And there was a modest increase in the retiree average annual benefit, which really is not out of line with what we've seen historically. As COLAs kick in and as a different level of salary experience hits that retiree workforce, that expense is projected to always sort of have an upward slope when all else is equal. On the teacher side, over on the right, active membership also went down by a much smaller magnitude, from just shy of 10,000 members to about 9,955. Number of retirees has increased by from 9,843 to 1,106. Similar kind of stories with all the other demographic factors at the bottom, but one sort of interesting thing here in both systems is that the plans have continued to mature, meaning that ratio of actives who are currently paying in to the system relative to non-actives. So that would be retirees and beneficiaries who are currently getting a benefit, and terminated vested members, or they sometimes refer to them as deferred members. Those are folks who are no longer working, but they've already earned a future benefit that they'll be able to draw once they hit retirement age. So we've seen the plans continue the trend of maturing, and now the ratio on the VSERS side exceeds 1-to-1. It's now 1.04, and on the other side we now have 1.11 non-actives for every active. Sir,
if I could just point out, and this might get to the question that was raised a little earlier, also with respect to the number of, if you just look at the retired members and beneficiaries and the teachers, from 2020 to 2021. There was an increase of 263 retired teachers. Now that takes into effect that some of the teachers, retirees passed away in that year as well, but the net change is an increase of 263. Typically, we're, I don't know if this is the average, but we generally see around 300 teachers retire each July. And sometimes that goes up or down, but just using that 300 as sort of a benchmark, the increase was only 200, the net increase was only 263. So that illustrates that we didn't have a huge increase in the number of people retiring.
Okay, yep, thanks. I was noticing that number, it felt big to me. It's good to know that it's sort of average.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All of my future slides from slide 11 on are essentially data updates of the charts that you've already seen in the interim reports, just so you have a sort of flavor of what's changed since in the last year, or the magnitude to which it has or hasn't changed. This chart of unfunded liability drivers, the things that were above the line, the factors that added to the unfunded liability, are the exact same from year to year. It's just the numbers have changed a little bit, but the relative impacts are largely consistent in the aggregate from the start of the amortization period at the beginning of 09 through the end of FY21. Chart 12 shows you that little waterfall chart with the steps that show, all right, how much did that unfunded liability grow each year? You could see that on the far right, we added a little step at FY21, 23.9 for the teachers, or for the state employees rather. So that's certainly much, much smaller than the increase we saw in the prior year. And it's one of the smaller increases we've seen year over year since the current amortization period started. Slide 13 is my microscopic font that is much more legible on when you're following along digitally, but added a column over it, FY21, just to show you what the relative impacts have been from all these factors. You already saw that FY21 data in a much more legible font on one of the earlier slides, but this way we can sort of look back over the different years and compare and see what has happened from year to year with different factors. And then slide 14, similar story with the teachers. None of the red bars above the line changed from the prior version. Only the sort of numbers associated with them changed, but the relative impacts of how much each factor has contributed to the growth in the unfunded liability really didn't change much from year to year. Slide 15, same waterfall chart for the teacher unfunded liability development. You can see that it's a little bit smaller of an increase. It went up $17 million in FY21. So still went up, which is not where we want to, is not the direction we want to see it go, but it went up by a much smaller degree than we have seen in most of the other years since FY09. Chart 16 is the same sort of updated data that shows you what the relative impacts were since FY09. And again, that data is in more legible format in one of the earlier slides. Slide 17, these charts where you start seeing, 1A, 1B, these are all the same charts that came right out of the interim report that was issued last month. I just added a couple additional data points to reflect the extra year. You can see that on chart 17, the trend in assets and liability growth is pretty much the same that it has been over time. We haven't seen massive changes with that. And the dollar figures are there, so you can compare it a little easier, because I know whenever you're trying to scale things to a vertical axis like this, it can be hard to see the really small differences from year to year. Slides 18 and 19 show sort of what the ADAC versus actual contributions were for each fund. In both systems, the actual contribution made in FY21 exceeded the ADAC. So that trend has continued, where the amount of money that the state has paid in has exceeded the actuarial recommended amount. And you could see how the funded ratios have trended to add that extra year as well. So now we're at, for the VSERS, we are at 66.4% funded last year. Now we're at 67.6. For the teachers, I think we're at 51.3 last year, if memory serves correct, and now it's 52.9. So small change. Yes, sir.
Chris, could you add to these charts somewhere, just that this is on an actuarial value basis? But I saw it on some of the previous charts, like on page 17, on page 18. And
so the funded ratio on an AVA basis? Yeah, we can do that. Slide 20 shows what the ADAC, I just added another year to reflect what the ADAC costs as a percentage of covered payroll. So you see that really big increase from FY21 to 22. That reflects the new assumption changes. That's why that increased as steeply as it did. Slide 21 just shows another year of the normal cost and how the share of the total normal cost that is paid by employer and employee compares. We're pretty much in line with where we were last year. We're substantially similar. And again, the normal cost is driven more by changes to assumptions than by your demographic experience or your investment or your demographic experience from year to year. That stuff shows up in the unfunded liability. And since there weren't any major changes to assumptions this year because we do an experience study or change the assumed rate of return. The normal cost is pretty much in line with where it was in the previous year. Slides 22 and 23, you saw the blue line in the treasurer's presentation earlier. The funded ratio, and again, we can add it on an AVA basis, is just layered in there so you can see what has changed from year to year. But again, there hasn't been a substantial change compared to the last valuation. Slide 24 is that chart that shows historic and projected ADEC growth. This does not compare where we were last year. This just reflects the new going forward assumption. And again, this is all just based on all else is held equal moving forward and that our costs will never increase beyond what is expected. We all know that's not the case, but based on the FY21 actuarial valuation, this is what we expect the ADEC to do. These lines really changed very little from the last time you saw this. The only real change is you go back a few slides with that bar chart showing comparing the different amortizations. And there was a really small increase in future costs as a result of it that shows up in here, but the overall trend is the same. Charts 25 and 26 just compare projected growth rates using FY21 as a base year on slide 25, then using FY22 as a base year on slide 26. The general fund revenue line did not change since the last time you saw this chart because our revenue assumptions have not changed. The only thing that has changed is the numbers under the blue and orange lines by very small amounts. And they really are just adjusted to reflect the new revised assumption for the ADEC costs moving forward. So the change was really very small. Slide 27 I put in here because I wanted to show on the left, there's a page in the actuarial valuations that show you what your 5, 10, 15, and 20-year average returns are on any given year. It's kind of an interesting metric to track from year to year because you can see how different years' investment performance can really skew these numbers over time. And again, since these projections are so long-term in nature, you don't want to have 1 year of really good or really poor investment results drastically change your assumptions. So sometimes it's good to look at, all right, what was our 5-year average, 10, 15, 20, and does what our future assumptions, are they out of whack compared to what we've sort of experienced historically? And how do we get some of the noise from year to year volatility out? So you can see in FY20 and FY21, how differently 1 year's returns can move these numbers when we had 1 year that was as strong as FY21. So I think it's kind of interesting to compare that our assumed rate of return is 7%, and you go a year back, and we very rarely hit 7% on sort of a long-term, reflection back. And now, just with the addition of 1 extra year, that moves it up above 7 for 5 and 10 years. Now, the standard disclaimer of past performance does not predict future performance certainly applies here as well. This is an interesting thing to look at. And it's an interesting trend to look at, but I would not base my assumed rate of return in the future based on what our past investment performance was, just because, the world changes, the investment market changes, interest rates change. There's all these other factors, but I wanted to show these next to each other so you all had a sense of how this 1 year's change in those returns can really move some of these numbers.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When, we're seeing like 6.55% and 6.31, and that during that time period, like the last 15 years, wasn't the assumption around 8%?
Yes.
So, and that wasn't caught by anyone that it was so far off.
One thing to keep in mind is that these longer term ones also include the Great Recession. So they do include a couple years that were really historically bad as far as investment performance goes.
Okay.
So yeah, that one of the time frame of the years that are averaged in obviously fluctuates every year as well. So if you've got a
the same way the 1 year.
exactly, it goes both ways.
Yeah.
And then slides 28 and 29 pivot over to demographics and membership trends. So I don't think these slides were in the interim report, but they've been in my sort of working master spreadsheet of all things pensions that, you could see how the sort of active and retiree and beneficiary, that the non-active workforce has trended over time. And I also added some little blocks here to show the terminated vesteds. So those are also included in the non-actives. It generally, we haven't seen a lot of really large changes in the terminated vested group over time, but you can obviously see that the number of retirees and beneficiaries has increased over time, which we've discussed throughout this process. And you could see how that ratio of non-actives to actives now it went from 0.96 to 1.04 on the state side in just 1 year. Similar story on slide 29 for the teachers. Only we saw the in both systems, we saw the size of the active workforce go down a little bit while the size of the non-actives has increased. And the teacher system already had a higher ratio of non-actives to actives, and that has just continued to increase as well. Sir.
I just have a question. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this part correctly. Thinking back to 2008 on Easter's membership piece there, we're down, it looks like about, can't tell which number it is there, 700 or so employees. If our numbers were back to that 10,685, it would increase our assets, but it would also increase unfunded liability amount. Is that correct?
I'm not sure it would increase your unfunded liability amount. It would increase your liabilities.
The liabilities.
It would increase your liabilities.
Okay. Yeah. So it would increase liabilities, but it would also be bringing money in because there'd be more people paying into the
It
system.
would be, but there's a little bit of nuance around this too, because the contributions that a active member pays out of their check doesn't fully fund their liabilities.
Right.
It funds roughly half of the cost.
Yeah.
The other half is paid for by the state.
Yeah.
So, there's some nuance around it. Slide 30 takes a look at the average age and average years of service. I tried to make the axes on this tell us something and make the line look like any sort of trend, because if this goes from like 0 to 15, the line looks kind of flat. But really, we haven't seen seismic changes in sort of the nature of the workforce. We have seen that the state average years of service has gone down a little bit. The average age has come down just a little bit. And again, some of this you're seeing is demographic baby boomers retiring in pretty large cohorts over the last 10 years or so. And then the workforce obviously gets a little bit younger as you have a higher group of people sort of age out of the system and leave the active and become retirees. So you see that here a little bit in both systems. The average age, one of the sort of interesting things is the average age for a teacher, average years of service rather for a teacher tends to be a little bit higher than for a state employee. But we did not see really big changes year to year on any of these metrics. The average member compensation between sort of actives and retirees, no crazy spikes there. They just sort of continue their upward trend, which we would expect through COLAs and salary growth and just sort of the natural attrition of the workforce. 31 basically shows you the same information, but in a slightly different format. And that instead of being on an individual member basis is in an aggregate basis. So you can see that the chart on the left here shows you what the total active payroll has trended. So this isn't number of people. This is what is the total cost of all of those people who are working. So the VSERS active payroll is assumed to increase by 3.5% a year. We actually saw very little increase from year to year. On the teacher side, it's presumed to increase by, and that's likely due to the fact that we've got a lot of vacancies. So we saw that number of actives go down from year to year. The teacher side, the payroll is assumed to grow at a rate of 3% a year, and we still continue to see an upward slope there. And then the retirement allowance trends, again, you can see that the aggregate amount that's sort of being paid out in benefits has sort of continued its historic steep increase since the recession, which we would expect through, baby boomers retiring. You've got a large cohort of people retiring. People are living longer. So, these trends are just continuing to manifest themselves, and they haven't really changed, quite frankly, from year to year. And the retirement allowances, they've increased the way they have been. They've been trending with the COLA and with salary growth in the active workforce. So not really a lot of changes on the demographic side. I think the really interesting story is that the plans have continued to mature. We have a lot of vacancies on the state employee side, and we've seen that sort of the size of the active workforce really has not been growing very much on either side from year to year. So I think it's probably not a surprise to any of you who come from labor, but it is always refreshing to see it reflected in the data. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them or chase down any other answers.
I did not.
Oh. Anybody?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we said that we would talk a little bit about, before we go to the agenda setting, we talk a little bit about if anybody had any reflections, comments, observations on the written comments that were submitted. Does anybody have? Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, I had a chance to read through all of them during that time, which was great to be able to kind of see all of that. One of the things that popped out to me was just looking at who was submitting them, the number of people that are females submitting compared to males, and also multiple people speaking to how as females and in their lives they're their sole income earners. They have children that they're responsible for also, and how being able to prepare for retirement budgets over the past 15 years for them has been dictated by what they were told their compensation would be as their pension, and basing all of their financial decisions on that information, and just how kind of devastating the consideration of changes could impact them. It was interesting to see that a couple of people in there. There are a lot of people also talking about there's more people talking about revenue. There are some people talking about one-time funds. A lot of people talking about how the pension is what drew them into this work. Somebody had a sentence in there that they said, "I don't have to be a teacher. I want to be a teacher, but cuts to the pension would drive me away from doing something that I want to be able to do that I love doing." That was one that kind of stuck with me there as well. If you didn't have the chance to go through them all, I really think it's worth the time. Report that I believe the person's name was Jeff Briggs. Yes, Jeff Briggs put in there as a recommendation that we should read a paper from the Brookings Institute about the sustainability of state and local government pensions. There's a PDF link right in there also. I haven't had a chance to read through that, but I'd like to do that. He also spoke about Hank Kim and the sustainability valuation, which was great to hear. Again, people following along with what we're doing and paying attention. I think it just goes to show the importance that this has to people. Trying to see if there's anything else in here. I did see what John was referencing, that one member spoke about, feeling like they haven't been informed about the pensions. And I do think that's a really good thought for us to continue to have, of making sure that people are informed about these things. Those were kind of my initial first glance pieces.
I read through them, and I have to admit that I found them less helpful than the oral witnesses, because I think that there were more people here who didn't understand the magnitude of the problem and didn't really understand where there were a lot of comments like the state has been mismanaging this for 20 years and the state is at fault. There were a lot of those kind of comments where I didn't see those in the oral presentation. So I thought these were less helpful than the spoken.
Yeah, there were some like that. I wouldn't say that all of them were. I did notice that too, that there were some like that, more so than the spoken testimony.
Right. Yeah. Other comments or observations or?
There was one other person, I think it was one of the final ones I read, Carl Whedon or Whedon was speaking about how he's already eligible to retire. He doesn't want to retire right now. He loves his job and wants to keep doing it. And the retirement plan was a huge reason of why he does this work. And so it's another good reminder that you know, we don't want to lose those people who want to continue working for fear of pension cuts.
Anybody else have any observations about what they, or, and if you didn't have time to read them, that's fine too.
I did notice a couple people the other night that I forgot about earlier today when we were talking about, brought up exactly what I remember my personal experience was a couple years ago, I mean, in the winter, which was that just to be aware when we're talking about people close to retirement, that there's not an automatic immediate cutoff at a certain point. And suggesting graduated consideration if we look at close to retirement as an issue.
As opposed to just a cliff,
Right.
5 months, 5 years and 5 months and 3 months,
Right.
35 years and 3 months, yeah.
Right.
I haven't had a chance to read the written testimony, but in conversations I've had with fellow employees, that comment has come up
Yeah.
in terms of, you know, having some sort of graduated nature to what we propose.
So we can jump to agenda setting then. And before we do, I'm going to make a comment here that probably is going to have everybody jumping down my throat, but you know, I'm willing to do that anyway.
Are you sure you want to?
Yeah, because it's something that's been bothering me. I think that we're looking at a pension system here that is operated before the pandemic and will operate after the pandemic. And I think that it's really unfortunate. I mean, we can't do anything about it, but it's just unfortunate that we're dealing with this issue right now in the midst of this horrible pandemic where everybody feels that they're working harder, they're working longer, their working conditions are terrible. But I think we have to, in my mind anyway, I have to somehow separate that from an ongoing pension system that we're trying to stand up so that it'll be there forever. And this pandemic hopefully won't go on forever, and we won't have people in those situations where they're feeling that they just can't go on anymore. So I just needed to say that because I think that it is unfortunate that we're doing this in the middle of this, where everybody, working conditions are terrible. I mean, we've heard from state employees and teachers and everybody else that working conditions are terrible. The stress is just terrible. And we have a shortage of workforce partly because of the pandemic. So we're dealing with, so anyway, I just needed to get that off my chest because I think that we need to remember that we're looking at a system that is going to be able to stand up for the next 30 or 40 years, and hopefully the pandemic won't be with us and won't be having the same impact. So I just needed to say that. For whatever it's worth, probably not much.
No, I think that's a very good thing to remember. Yeah.
And I think simultaneously to that, it's sort of like Chris, you were saying earlier, that we don't really know how to predict. And so I think there isn't, people don't really know what's going to happen with the workforce over the next, 3, 4, 5 years. It's hard to say how things are going to spring. Are they going to spring back? Or, we don't know.
I don't know.
So I think, we have to kind of keep that open-mindedness around our solutions as well.
Okay. So thank you, Molly. I just need to say that. So let's put a agenda setting unless anybody else wants to make some grand statements here. Okay. So I think that what we have to The assumptions that we're working under are that we need more time to let the actuaries give us their report. Then we need a block of time for us to review that. But we don't want to put it off so far that we don't have the ability to then modify those and ask for another round. Are those really the assumptions we're working under?
I think so.
Okay. So we need to keep all of those in mind when we set the dates. So with that, somebody make some proposals. Yes, Andrew.
I'm gonna propose for, I know we're considering, we have the 22nd book, so we're questioning whether we're gonna have our meeting on the 10th of November, or the 17th. I'm proposing that for one of those dates, I know that the Marijuana Control Board released a report recently about their revenue projections. And I would love for them to come and speak with us and talk about that, knowing that revenue is something that we're supposed to be looking at. I know Graham Campbell had mentioned the number of 20 to 25 million in revenue. And my understanding from the control board is that they're thinking by 2025, that number is going to be closer to 46 million. And Jeanette, I know I've heard you say before that there are a lot of people after that money. I would just love to get firsthand information from them that I think could help inform us of what's available. Thinking also about what Treasurer Pierce said this morning, that revenue has to be a part of the solution.
You do have to remember that their projections, their proposals for fees have not been approved yet by the legislature.
Yeah, I still think it would be worth our time to hear from them. I think that's a fair point, but I think it would be worth hearing from them, knowing that it's a topic that's come up many times.
Come in.
I have to push back on that. I think the Cannabis Control Board has a heavy lift ahead of them. I mean, I'm fine with having, Graham come back in with their numbers. But I really don't want to get in the way of the Cannabis Control Board finishing their mission and getting us the information we need so we can set their fees in the next session.
Yeah, that's true.
Because, legislation already dedicates a very large percentage of that revenue to substance education. So I mean, if you're looking at a revenue source, I would say that is one of the least likely ones that you can tackle.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding your point, John. You're saying that you don't want to ask them to come in because you're worried that it's going to interfere with the work that they're trying to do?
With their time.
Yeah, they've just been stood up in this year.
Sure.
I mean,
can we let them speak for themselves though?
no, I think, I really don't want to interfere with their work.
Wouldn't they tell us if we were interfering with their work or not?
No,
I think
because the legislature asked them to come in, they will come in.
They will come. They won't tell us. So I think John has a point. There are 3 people and they have to get everything done by January.
Okay.
For us. And I mean, we could have Graham come in and take those numbers that they have projected and tell us what it would look like. I mean, already we know that 6% of all of it is going to education. So that's already a given. Of the 14% excise tax, 30% right off the top is going to education prevention. So that leaves not a lot of money.
so
And I'm
36% tied up.
And I'm proposing that a portion of it go to the municipalities, because they're the ones that are gonna.
I would agree.
And I am going to push that. The municipalities are the ones that need money. So, anything, Michael?
I just have a question, just as a follow to what Andrew just asked about, just additional revenue or other revenues in general. I'm curious to know if there's a consensus of the committee as to whether or not there's support for additional or new revenues in general first. And then if there is there also a sense that part of this committee's challenge is have to identify specifically where those revenues come from? Those are questions.
So my answer to that, which I've stated many times, is that I don't know if we need to have additional revenue. I'm not going to say new, I'm going to say additional revenue to the over the ADEC. If we could define approximately how much that is, I don't feel comfortable defining the source of it. That's my personal.
It just seems to me from listening to the conversations to date and thinking about the timeframes that we have left to come up with some recommendations that there needs to be a conversation about if there's a belief or a consensus that additional and or new revenues are going to be on the table as perhaps part of a overall package or not. Because it seems to me if we can't come to agreement on that, we may not come to agreement on much anything else. And I would just soon as get to that conversation sooner than later, quite frankly.
Well, are you separating the additional revenue from new revenue?
I'm not,
You're just talking about additional revenue. There's additional.
I guess I'm just making a distinction between additional revenue versus benefit changes.
And then within additional revenue, it seems like we've talked about one-time revenue and dedicated revenue
Correct.
stream. So
Correct.
we sort of have both of those to consider as well as any kind of possible change.
To me, that appears to be the sort of unspoken elephant in the room, quite frankly.
Yeah, so thinking about Andrew's specific comment about, one revenue source. I guess kind of echoing Michael's comments, we did put forth to the actuary to include different, dedicated revenue amounts of new or additional, just dedicated revenue. So I think we do have a responsibility to investigate. Not that we would say, okay, it's going to be for this and this and this, but put in the report, these are options to look at, or that we'd recommend be considered. Yeah, I guess if there isn't consensus, I'm kind of what we get back from the actuary is going to be dependent on those revenue amounts actually being applied. So yeah, I guess it is something we really need to get to have a conversation about.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that? And I do feel that if we come up with an amount and the actuaries come up with an amount that we think we need, and we all agree on, additional revenue beyond the ADAC, that I can see myself supporting that. I can't see myself supporting saying where it would come from. And the most I would be willing to do is to put an appendix on there and say, these are all the suggestions that have been made to us. And we've got all those suggestions. We don't need anybody else to come in and tell us what those are. We have the sports betting, the tax on the wealthy, marijuana, cutting 10% of the public safety. Well, I'm just saying that we could put all of that on there without making any
Without judgment.
recommendations or, that's where I think we are. But I'm willing to listen to anybody else.
Just on the point of the agenda setting, I don't want to interfere with the marijuana control board's work. So if you think that they'll come in and not speak up about coming in, if we can get Graham Campbell to come in, that's fine. I didn't realize the point that if they were asked to come in, that even if they have other work, that they would just accept. So Graham Campbell would be
They
fine.
pay attention to when the legislature asks an administration person to come, they come.
Yes,
And
thank you. That was just
Yeah.
understanding I didn't have,
Yeah.
but
But and I'm not sure what he would tell us either. If they put out their projections, we can figure out what those projections are.
I was just curious to hear more about in the report. It's a rather lengthy document that they put out. I haven't had the time to go through every single part of it. If we could have somebody in there come in who's more knowledgeable than any of us about the topic, speak to us, I think it's worth a 30-minute section of time.
So are you talking about just, I don't mean to monopolize here, but are you talking about the report or just the projected revenue? Because we're only looking at projected revenue. Their report deals with a lot more than that. And I don't think we should spend our time
The
hearing
revenue
about the
aspect,
report.
the revenue
Yeah,
aspect of
which we
it.
can just pull out of there.
Just thinking about maybe what Graham, what he could testify to, that would be helpful. I think when he testified previously, they were going to do an analysis on sports betting. What they had were very rough numbers. I don't know if that's something that they have conducted that would also help the discussion. I'm just throwing that out there as an idea.
Jeanette, you said something a minute ago where you said you could see yourself supporting revenue, but not dictating where, like, the you would be to put appendix in. I was just wondering if we could do a thumbs up, thumbs down on that statement. Like, how many people feel like they could see themselves supporting the possibility of a dedicated revenue stream?
No, I didn't say dedicated.
Oh, what did you?
I said
revenue.
additional revenue
Oh.
beyond the ADEC.
So,
For like a one time, you mean, so should I change
One
that?
time or more. One time.
so is your question whether an individual member of the task force would support it, or in political reality will it ever get signed by the government? Because
Right.
that is a different
Right,
question.
right, you're right.
And that's what I look at.
I have heard you say that before, John, and I appreciate your delineation of those two differences. Good.
Because what I might agree to
Right,
may in political reality be infeasible. And I think that's really important. If you're putting forward recommendations, our goal is to get them passed and signed by the government.
right.
Otherwise, they're unrealistic in my opinion.
And that's such a hard piece for me to swallow. I mean, I understand why. No, I understand why. Don't get me wrong. I just, I would love for each body to speak for itself, you know, sort of a, from a checks and balances kind of perspective, I guess. But yeah, I guess my question is if we have to be adding in the political realities to it, perhaps. I don't know. I didn't, that's kind of, my question was kind of your question again.
If the suggestions live as an appendix, I mean, the political reality of those can be tested as it moves further down the line. I mean, we know the governor supports sports betting. You know, revenue, cannabis revenue is revenue that exists. It hasn't been fully dispersed yet. So, yeah, I think there's a distinction between additional revenue and new revenue. That, you know, there's some existing capacity and there's some new revenue that the administration has been pretty vocal about supporting. So I'm not sure, you know, the idea of no new money isn't a political reality, but
Well, that isn't new money.
sports betting.
Yeah, okay. So I made a list. I went through all our notes and I made a list. Surcharge on the top earners, sports betting, portion of the lottery, temporary surcharge on employees' contributions to go to the unfunded liability, portion of any state surplus, cannabis proceeds, Hopper savings. And then I listed the savings that he wrote in there, which are, anyway, let's comment. But those are the suggestions that have come up so far.
And I think in terms of the appendix, thinking about having an appendix that has this list in it, I think it's important to explore the number that should go next to that suggestion. So sports betting, what's available? What could be available? What do they project being available? And how could it get us to whatever number we suggest we're going to roll on out after we see whatever comes from the actuary? If we decide as a group, as a body, that we want to see 80 million, I don't even know what to call it, 80 million
Additional resources or additional funds.
recurring
Yeah.
revenue from year to year, whether it's new or old or designated or whatever. Where is that? It would be irresponsible for us to put that suggestion forward without and here's where it could come from. I think we have to give folks the information, all of the information when we give them the information, not a list, but a list with, and this is where the money could come from. And you can pick and choose from our list here. Maybe it comes to 200 million, you can pick and choose how to find your 80. That's for you guys to figure out. But here's our suggestions for where money comes from.
I'm thinking about this question of the politics versus what the task force believes a little more. And I guess I feel like we really should put forth what we believe, and we can write about it in terms of, you know, like Kate was saying, if it's open-ended about where the money comes from and how much each one is, like if we put forth, this is what we believe should happen, this amount of money in one-time funds because we'll gain this much from that over this amount of time. This is what we think should happen in recurring benefits because we'll gain this much from that over this kind of time. This is what should happen in employee contribution changes because it'll gain this much over time. And whatever else we might come up with. Then that's, then we're putting forth our due diligence. And then when the legislative bodies look at it, then they say, can we swallow this? Or how much of this can we swallow? Which parts of this can we swallow? And that's their due diligence based on what they know about, like including political realities. But I feel like I want to put forth our, you know, what we have learned over these 8 or 9 months and say, this is what we truly believe is best for our state. Because that's what I feel like I was charged with. Am I just too much of a Pollyanna?
No, I think if you want to identify appendices, you know, the different sources of revenue and what the likely amount of revenue that could be achieved from each of those sources, that's.
And is it an appendix issue versus?
Well, I mean, I think you could reference it in the report, but I mean, if you want to get into details, it might just end up in the appendix. I mean, but you can say, okay, total revenue, total likely revenue that's unspoken for from cannabis is X. Sports betting, I don't think it's been identified for anything. Wealth tax, you know, that's not even in legislation right now. So, and then, you know, surcharge charge on contributions, which is what Jeanette mentioned. I mean, we could put those out there. That's fine.
Yeah,
And yeah, Molly, I would just echo your point that I'm with you, that I think our job is to put out what we believe in, and we're going to be talking to our members about our proposal. And if we put something out there, you know, we're talking to our members about what we truly believe in, I'm sure they're going to be contacting their local leaders saying, hey, we need you to also get behind this as well. You know, if we're putting out a report that those of us at this table who we don't believe in, don't know, then how can we look somebody straight in the face and say support this when we don't believe in it ourselves?
I mean, I think of the scenarios that we put forward, actually did include, you know, additional revenue as part of that. I think we all were comfortable enough putting that forward to the actuaries to see what that's. So I mean, you know, to me, maybe we have to have a conversation now or soon, but you know, at least we can wait and see what those numbers come back at. And in terms of our group, I think we were put here to, you know, get to a compromise because, you know, in some way, you know, it didn't happen in one session. I don't think we're going to get to a compromise if there are only structural reforms. I don't think we're going to get to a compromise if there are only revenues. So I think that's our answer.
Yep.
all right, so where are we here with Michael's question and Andrew's suggestion that we have somebody come in and talk to us more definitively about the, I mean, I think if we go through our notes, Graham was pretty clear about what you'd gain if you put a surcharge on top of earners. But the sports betting was, he had 2.5 million. We had, somebody suggested a portion of the lottery. I have no idea what that is. Right now it all goes to education. So we'd be stealing from the ed fund. Portion of any state surplus, and I think Peter has already talked about that. Cannabis proceeds. I looked at the numbers, some numbers, and I came up with $159,000.
What source was that? Sorry.
Cannabis. I don't remember what I started with, but I looked at some numbers that were projected when we first did that bill. And if you take out the 6% that's going to the education fund, 30% is going to prevention and education. I with $350,000 that first year.
Would it be helpful to have a refresher on what numbers we're trying to get to?
That's what I might.
And then, and having that conversation in advance of getting the information from the actuary that will identify what potentially numbers could be associated with whether it's additional revenue or structural reforms.
Right.
But just have a sense and maybe some sort of agreement on, yes, we're trying to get to this number in the state system, or trying to get to this number. And I think if I remember correctly from our charge, in some cases, we have to come up with different benchmarks. Is that correct, Chris?
25 and 100%, right?
Yeah.
That was an old version of the legislation. Act 75 that most recently, the as-passed version, left it somewhat open-ended and pegged it at somewhere between 25 and 100%.
Okay, so we didn't have to do the 25-50%.
No, that was a prior version of the
Okay.
legislation that was amended
Okay.
through the process. So there's latitude between 25 and 100.
So maybe refresher on just like what exactly the range is,
Right.
Beat the high and the low, and then trying to figure out what we want to shoot for.
That is in testimony I provided a couple of weeks back. I'll try to find the date I did it so folks can reference it, but it was in one of my earlier
I
slides.
remember that. I think it'd just be helpful and instructive, as I said, as part in anticipation of the data from the actuary, if we have a target approximately what we're trying to get to.
And are there two targets here or one? One is the structural changes around the normal costs, funding more of the normal costs through. And then the other is the unfunded liability. Are there two targets or are they?
It was the ADEC and the unfunded liability.
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
Yep.
Huh?
Yeah.
All right, so do we want to continue this conversation at our next meeting and get some updates on the.
Yeah, we can probably get an update on the cannabis tax, but I think we should also get an explanation of what's already been allocated to other uses. I do know with respect to sports gambling, there's a formal study due to the legislature in October.
Right.
So it may be done. So we may be able to get that information as well. And I know there's been work done on the wealth tax. I don't know how detailed that is, but I believe there has been work done on that.
I think he had a bunch of numbers here.
Well, he had a bunch of numbers,
1% on it.
3%, 1.5, yeah.
Yeah.
So there is some information there.
And then hopefully we could get the target number.
Are we looking for the target number for the ADEC or that funded liability target or both?
Both.
So I think we have that.
We do.
It's.
I think I have it. I think we have that, Andrew, in the,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's in August 4th. On page.
in the pension overview for the WB caucus that Colin put together for you, that document, I think it's in there.
Oh, yeah, I think I have all those numbers and I know in Chris's report too, where there was about the possible options, the levers it's listed in there pretty clearly.
So we could have Brad
Right, so.
update us on all this.
That'd be great.
So we'll go back through our notes and come up with the target numbers. We can all agree on what the target numbers are. And then have Graham come in and talk to us about if they have any update on any of those things. If he would know the cannabis one too. We're so far behind that I'm not sure we're gonna see anything. But that's anyway. And then we need to talk about whether those are one-time, recurring, and if recurring, how long? Like, are they connected to the health of the fund? Are they connected to something else? Do we just do them for 5 years? But I think that's,
I mean, just looking at the cannabis numbers, if they're not recurring, they're not gonna make much of a dent into the problem. I mean,
no, I meant our recommendation
oh,
that there be a recurring.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
there's the issue of one time versus recurring.
Yeah,
But I
yeah,
mean, if we're
yeah.
talking about these cannabis, sports gambling,
Yeah,
I mean, the amounts, at least in their Graham's original estimates they're not large.
That's one time.
Yeah, compared to one time.
okay. So okay, now, we know that we're gonna put this on the agenda. When are we gonna put it on the agenda? When do we want it?
Well, we should build out an agenda, because I mean,
Yes.
this is not gonna take an entire.
Right,
Yeah.
that's what I'm wondering is when, so we're looking at,
Can we offer other suggestions about other things we'd like to see on future agendas?
yes, please, that's,
Because I think it would be important to have Tom Palaka come back and speak with us.
About,
Well, the treasurer spoke earlier today about how he would be an important person to hear from.
about,
Oh, gosh, putting me on the spot at 3:00 in the afternoon.
I think she was talking about,
investment.
About this, yes.
Okay.
How things look at the end of this next.
Perfect. If you know the answer, why don't you just write it down?
because he's a lawyer.
We're on the same team, remember?
Okay,
Okay,
okay. Just,
Are there other-
those are two issues.
and we do have the judiciary, but I don't know.
We
if
don't know
we'll
when.
have- We don't know when we'll have that here.
I know Jeanette and I already spoke about this. We read through all the written testimony. Other people could make sure to read through that and reflect on that in our next meeting. I think that'd be helpful as well. I would be curious to look at the paper that was linked from Jeff Briggs. I'm going to try and do that between now and our next meeting.
It's an interesting thing.
Picking up on that topic, and also Jeanette, you made a comment earlier that, maybe we should pull out from the testimony, concrete suggestions that people made. I think, that might be a good thing to do along with reviewing the public comments. I don't know if we want to do that individually or if, what the best way to compile that.
Well, I can take the responsibility for pulling them out as I heard them and then sending it out to everybody to see what they heard, if they heard the same things and adding to, and some of the concrete suggestions, and then we can have all be working from the same list. Does that work?
That sounds great.
Okay, I will do that.
And then can I ask a question about your list?
Yeah.
When you were just kind of rattling them off, and I didn't hear every single one, but was capital gains, getting rid of capital gains exemption on that list?
No,
As a possibility for what place to get additional revenue?
15 to 20 million.
Yeah, we
for
talked
Brian
about that
Campbell.
a couple times. I wondered if you can just get that. I wasn't sure if I heard it. I didn't think I heard it, but I wasn't sure if I was right.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
will.
Okay.
I think the task before us in the next month is to take a binder like this and put it on a page. That's kind of the task. We're just gonna cut and cut and cut until we get down to the very essentials.
Is your binder larger than mine?
Nope. No, and not as well organized, probably.
Well, I think we actually have two different things that are going to, two different products that we're gonna end up with. One is the report, which is going to be adding to the interim report that we've already done. And the other one is going to be the very specific recommendations that are being made that will go into the piece of legislation. Because we're going to have a piece of legislation drafted. And that the legislature then can start looking at, and that's where the actual recommendations are gonna have to go. And so the report and all that won't be, that'll be more, Molly, your one page, although it will be one page, the way we write legislation, it'll be many pages, but that's, yeah. But that is a product.
So I'm going to pull a Jeanette here, and I'm going to say something. People might jump down my throat on this. That might not be popular, but I'm wondering about Chris. I know you do a great job of putting together presentations. I'm wondering about JFO being able to put together not necessarily recommendations, but ways that we could achieve those revenue benchmarks that we sent to the actuaries of 30, 50, 75 million. Not suggestions on how to do it, recommendations, but ways that it could be accomplished for us to consider.
That is the question that's above my paper.
I'm not sure I understood what you were asking.
So what I'm asking for is knowing that if we're trying to consider different revenue amounts, which we put out to the actuaries, 30 million, 50 and 75, if JFO has the ability to put together a presentation saying, here's how you could accomplish $30 million in revenue. You could get X amount from this source, X amount from this source, X amount of this source, not saying we recommend that you do these things, but here's how that goal can be accomplished.
We do just for everyone's background, early in this process, we handed out some hard copies of this little publication we do called Fiscal Facts. It's also on the JFO website. There's a section in there that will show you what the incremental increase of revenue will be if you increase all the different taxes by like 1% or a penny, or like whatever the increment that makes sense to look at it is. That could be a good starting point for sort of understanding the magnitude of what different numbers are likely to generate and what the full universe of revenue streams is. So it may be worth revisiting that book before we meet again. But revenues are not deal with. I'm good at spending the money. I'm not good.
Chris, what did you say? Where can you find that again
It's
online?
on the JFO website. It's probably on the publications tab. It's called Fiscal Facts.
Fiscal Facts.
It's even simpler. It's in Graham Campbell's PowerPoint presentation when he testified before,
Okay.
Yeah.
before us. And it has links to other tax information as well as the revenue items we've already discussed, cannabis, sports gambling, et cetera.
Were there other things that we want to make sure we get on the agenda for whenever we put them on? But just getting out the things now that we want to get on the agenda. It looks like you have to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you. We're so used to hearing you on. No. So,
Well, I mean, another thing that we have the information for is cross subsidization.
yeah,
And we've had the actuarial work done on that, so we could have a discussion about what to do about that.
I didn't hear what you said about
Cross subsidization,
cross.
because we already have the actuarial work done. We just haven't discussed what, if anything, we want to do.
John, I couldn't hear the other thing you said about 3 minutes ago either. Do you remember what it was? It was another agenda item. I think Jeanette wrote it down.
Well, I don't think I talked about either one.
No, okay.
I was just referencing where to find financial facts. That was the last.
Yeah, no, before that. It was a little while ago. Never mind. I let it float. stream, so
Sorry.
that was my fault not picking it up then.
I mean, what I have written down for an agenda is discussion of revenue, specifically having Graham Campbell come in and talk about different taxes that we've discussed. Then Tom Golaka talking about investment performance, reflecting on written testimony. Jeanette's going to pull out concrete suggestions from testimony.
I'll do that.
And then I have cross subsidization. If I missed anything, let me know.
No, the only other thing I had written was what Andrew was asking for, whether, it sounds like Chris can't provide that, but maybe through us looking at the joint fiscal, the fiscal facts document.
Right, and to Graham's report before, because he does say in there, if you raise the sales tax by 1%, this is what you're going to raise. But we all know that if we raise the sales tax, it's not going to help us anyway, because it's going to go to the education fund. So just looking at what he presented here, and I think that he did a nice kind of summary of the joint fiscal facts.
Well, we're also going to get back actuarial numbers, right? So everything that we asked for, we're going to want to process. So
Yes, I think that what we were talking about now is, are there things that before we get those numbers that we can get out of the way so that when we get those numbers, we are prepared to focus on those. Is that, yeah.
So you're sort of thinking about the next meeting as opposed to the next 5 meetings right now. I thought we were looking at the broader whole 5. Okay.
We have 2 meetings, the meeting next week and the meeting after that, where we won't have any actuarial information on the request we made.
So we
So
think we'll have December 1, we'll have it back then?
But some,
Because we can't.
Next 2 meetings are November 10th and the
But
17th.
I thought we canceled the 17th.
We haven't decided which one yet.
Oh, okay.
yeah,
I
so.
think Kate told you not to
Yeah,
cross
Right.
it out
confirmed,
yet.
yeah.
So we're just trying to figure out what
Those
issues we can discuss between now and when we receive the actuarial data back,
Right.
which we're anticipating we'll be able to discuss at the new meeting we agreed to on November 22nd.
Right, that was very succinct.
Which is from 12 to 5.
Yes.
Yes, we do that.
So, but we have potentially, and I say potentially, 2 meetings between now and the 22nd.
So let's hear preferences of which November 10th or November 17th, which is the preference to do, and we can put all these things on that agenda.
I wonder, aside from that for just a second.
Sure.
I want to just return to what Molly mentioned earlier in the day. I think it was Molly, a thought about having a second public hearing. And I know that has to be planned and it has to be warned and all of that. And so I just think timing wise, maybe that we should further that discussion.
We can put that on the agenda for discussion. Great, yes.
Yep.
Got it. All right, so any takers for the 10th or the 17th, or, yes?
My only suggestion is, I think it's more likely that the judiciary would be able to testify on the 17th than the 10th.
They might be ready by then.
So just if we were going to cancel one of those meetings, I would just, my choice would be to lean to having a meeting on the 17th so that we could get the judiciary in and hear their testimony.
I think that probably fills out the agenda more fully too. I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And
I won't be here on the 17th, but I will be on an airplane to Alabama, to see my daughter.
oh, okay.
But Mike, I'll make sure Mike is here to watch for me. At the very least.
And he will too.
I know he will.
Yes.
Is there a way to kind of leave it more up in the air and we reach out tomorrow to the people that we'd like to hear from and see if they can be here on the 10th?
I guess we could, I hesitate to leave it too long because that's a week from today. And although we all have it scheduled in our schedules, right? So,
All right, well,
yeah, so we don't need to, we've got it there already, yeah.
I mean, if you could leave it up to Jeanette to make sure we can get the testimony on the 10th, then we could just say, okay, we can get this all done on the 10th. So people prefer the 10th versus the 17th. Okay,
I prefer that we all be there.
okay.
Was there anyone who couldn't make it on the 10th?
Okay, great.
We may have a better sense from the actuaries on a week from today, the 10th, as to their timeframes for getting the information to us as well.
Okay, all right.
Right, then we could always readjust for the following week if
Right.
needed.
So will you ask Tom Belanca?
Yeah.
And I'll check with Pearson.
Yep.
And should I call Graham or do you want to?
Okay,
Okay, all right.
so that's.
And who do we want, who comes to talk to us about cross subsidization?
Chris did slides on that already, so
Yeah,
he
he
can,
did. You're the person.
he can walk
Okay.
us through those again, and
And-
then we have to have a discussion.
Yep.
Second public hearing, we don't need a witness.
No, that's just a discussion.
Written testimony, we don't need a witness, so that's,
Okay.
all the rest of the items we can do. Actually, it's a good idea to see if we can get it done on the 10th, because if we're lucky and the actuary gets his work done, then we can meet on the 17th.
We will both days, I'm just, hang on.
Yeah,
Okay,
Well, you're saying, hold on, but it's a little tricky at the school system, just because like I have a sub who's committed to that day, so I do need a little bit of warning, because I have to tell that person, actually, you don't have a job.
well, or you can have your son come in and you can just go down and sit on the river.
And I don't think that happens.
Or with the number of absences you have, that.
I could just fill
easily
in
be
for
shifted
somebody
off to
else.
someone else.
I'd like to be the
Sub for me.
teacher today.
Sub for me.
I should leave the meeting rooms in place then for the 10th and the 17th,
Yes.
because on the 17th, they wanted to move us to the legislative lounge, which is I think room 24.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. That's where we've been there before, so, yeah.
It's a lovely room. It's a lovely room.
When I first got up here, I heard a legislator sitting on the phone in there. There used to be 12 phones and 12 computers and everybody had to use them. They didn't have their own. And I heard him on a phone with a constituent and he was saying, yes, I'm in my office. It has a fireplace on one end and it has these great leather couches and things. And you could just hear this person on the other end sputtering because he was so upset that we had such grand offices. And then he said, and I shared with 179 other people. Okay,
Yeah, I ran into Taurus this summer, wanted to know where Governor's Mansion is.
Cedar Creek room. Yeah. Okay. Are we set? Okay. I will get that list out to people. I'll try to get it out by the end of tomorrow. And then people can have to correct me if I heard wrong.
We are holding both of these times
Yep.
and if, but we may not meet next week if judiciary is not prepared to, or. I mean, I have both these blocked.
we
off,
said we're gonna
so-
reach out to the 3 witnesses,
Okay.
Tom Blanca, judiciary, and Graham Campbell. I mean, Graham will probably be able
Yeah.
to testify next week. And see if they can testify next week. If they all can, then we can hold a meeting. If not, then we move it to the 17th. I mean,
Should we move the whole thing if judiciary isn't ready, or should we just do the rest of it on the, and have judiciary come in another time? Do we want to get this done with?
we could do that.
I suspect that their report is not going to be very long. They're gonna,
I suspect,
they looked at everything that we sent already to the,
I think they could probably be ready for next week,
we'll push it.
but we'll see.
Okay,
And then we'll probably substitute the 17th with the 22nd. We're doing the 22nd either way.
unless we get the actuarial reports much earlier than we thought.
Okay.
Right.
So, and
Not much earlier. We heard today, 18th or 19th, the end of that week. If we get them 1 day ahead or 2 days ahead on the 17th or the 16th, then we can make some progress and not do the 22nd.
Exactly.
Right.
Okay,
Phew.
yeah, because if we do all of those, we're over one meeting. I don't know if that matters, but we're at 21 then, I think, right? Pretty sure.
you know, I wouldn't worry about
Yeah,
that.
I didn't think it mattered, but except at the time. It's good.
This is kind of like trying to schedule a family reunion.
Thanks.
We're not quite as direct with each other yet as a family, though.